I'm the Reverend Dr. Alexia Salvatierra. I am the Assistant Professor of Integral Mission and Global Transformation, as well as the Academic Dean of Centro Latino here at Fuller Theological Seminary. We have our final session, Building a Healthy World, that we're going to look more broadly than we have looked to this point. We're going to look at congregations and their role. We're going to look at the whole creation and how we are in creation. And we're going to circle back to the seminary. What is the role of the seminary in building a healthy world? Now I'd like to introduce our three panelists. You can learn more about them along with all of our program participants in the speakers section of the Whova app. First, we have with us today Mary Chase-Ziolek. Dr. Chase-Ziolek is Professor Emeritus of Health Ministries and Nursing at North Park University and North Park Theological Seminary in Chicago. Involved in faith and health ministries for over 25 years, she was previously the coordinator of geriatric health ministry at Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago, where she developed an ecumenical, multi-ethnic network of congregations involved in health promotion. She has published and presented widely on health ministry and parish nursing. Her book, Health, Healing, and Wholeness, Engaging Congregations in Ministries of Health, was published by Pilgrim Press in 2005. Her work in health ministry has included identifying the unique aspects of giving and receiving nursing care in a congregation, engaging congregations in promoting the health of their communities, spirituality and personal health, seminary wellness, and faith and food. Also joining us is the Reverend Dr. Randy Woodley, who currently serves as Distinguished Professor of Faith and Culture at George Fox University, Portland Seminary. He is an activist, scholar, distinguished speaker, teacher, and wisdom keeper. Dr. Woodley is the author of several books, and his expertise has been sought in national venues as diverse as Christianity Today, the Huffington Post, Moody Radio, and Time Magazine. He and his wife, Edith, are co-sustainers and co-hosts of a permaculture regenerative teaching farm, school, and community in Yamhill, Oregon, housed at Eloheh Indigenous Center for Earth Justice and Eloheh Farm. Dr. Woodley is also a Cherokee descendant recognized by the Kitoa Band. Finally, we have Dr. Tina Armstrong with us today. Dr. Armstrong is Director of Clinical Training and Associate Professor of Clinical Psychology in the Clinical Psychology Department at Fuller Theological Seminary. Armstrong is the Principal Investigator of the Black Women's Spirituality Research Lab, which conducts research that collaborates with African American women and men of African descent in efforts to understand issues related to spirituality and well-being. As a community psychologist, she has a strong commitment to bridging the gap between academia and historically underserved communities by facilitating the training and development of students. As a licensed clinical psychologist, Dr. Armstrong has a clinical practice that focuses on the mental health and well-being of Black women. She is a member of the American Psychological Association, Association of Black Psychologists, and Sisters of the Academy. She sits on the executive board of the California Psychological Association's Division II, which focuses on education and training. Dr. Armstrong is an amateur gardener who enjoys playing in nature. We are so grateful to have all of you with us today. So let's begin with you, Dr. Chase-Ziolek.
Well, what a pleasure to be with you virtually today and to talk about this important topic about how we build a healthier world. My context is working with congregations in looking at how churches, and I've also worked with synagogues as well too in the past, but how they can be part of building a healthier world. So as I began, and my context is in the U.S. I haven't worked in other countries in this area. So as we look at the context for congregations being engaged in ministries of health today in the United States, I want to set the context, and this is pre-COVID, of some significant things that were influencing healthcare and influencing congregations before we moved into the whole impact of living during a pandemic. First of all, in the area of healthcare, and this is really significant because when you look at how churches can promote health, you have to look at what contributes to health. Health's not just about individual behavior. There's a lot of other factors that play in there. So one of the things that we see more and more in healthcare, in the literature, also in hospitals and the kind of information that they're collecting, is the importance of the social determinants of health, of where we live, work, and play. And that means that things such as access and quality of healthcare, access and quality of education, the neighborhood you live in, the social context, all influence your health. Which means that for any groups, any individuals who are part of a marginalized group, that is likely to have a detrimental impact on health. And so this has been a growing awareness. The other growing awareness in healthcare in the last 10 years has been an increase in focus on population health and how to promote the health of groups of people, not just individuals. And that has to do with how hospitals are reimbursed, but it also means that hospitals are much more aware of the need to connect to their communities. And if you're going to connect to your communities, churches and other faith groups are a very logical way to do that. Well, there's nothing like living during a pandemic, which none of us have ever done before, to highlight how the social determinants of health are reflected in the people who are more likely to get COVID, more likely to die from COVID, and the tremendous challenge that has been for our healthcare system. Now, in the context of congregations, one thing that's important to notice, again, this being pre-COVID, is that growing awareness of the impact of religious practices on health. And there's this whole area of research of people looking at how religious practices influence health. What that means is things such as the experience of belonging, the meaning that comes from religious participation, spiritual practices, all of those things that you might never use the word health when you're talking about it, can potentially influence health. And then we've also seen changes in religious participation. So all of these things is now churches having to respond to COVID, which has majorly impacted the ways of being the church, having to rethink creatively and, what does it mean to be the church during a pandemic? So those are important things to keep in mind as we look at what churches are doing, what churches can do, and what does all this mean. So as we're thinking about engaging congregations in ministries of health, we start off looking at what's your context? What are the needs and interests of the congregation and the community in which you are? And what are the challenges and the opportunities for health? All congregations, are going to be different in terms of the communities that you're in, the people who are part of the church, where there are opportunities and where there are challenges. Which means that as you're developing health ministries, looking at how to be culturally congruent, what is consistent with who you are in terms of your religious tradition, what is consistent in terms of the ethnic background of the people in your church. And it's also important to look at, as you're developing ministries of health, what is theologically sound from whatever religious tradition you're coming from, and what is also sound healthcare practice as well too. So we want to build on those things. Now, as we look at the ministries of health that are most predominant in the United States, we see a couple of different models that really stand out. And first of all, there's the faith community nursing model, which originally was called parish nursing. Nurses working in congregations, sometimes as volunteers, sometimes in paid positions. When they're in paid positions, often they're affiliated with a hospital, but not always. Looking at health promotion, providing health education, providing advocacy, providing support. Usually not providing traditional nursing services like a home health nurse would. So we see a lot of that in the United States. We also have the model of health ministers, and a health minister may not be a nurse, and they may be another kind of health professional, a nutritionist, an occupational therapist, physical therapist, a social worker. They may be a minister and have a particular interest in health. And they would do similar things, but functioning within the capacity, whatever their professional capacity might be. Now, another approach, another model for health ministry is a health ministry team, where you have a group of health people, that may be various kind of health professionals, people who are interested because of personal experience. And there you can draw on working together in the different resources. So there's a lot of different models. Now, some churches are also doing clinics, and those clinic models either sometimes may be very specific for a function like a foot care clinic for people who are homeless. There are many churches I know who have had free clinics for a season. Or sometimes if they do really well, then they usually turn into something bigger and become a self-sustaining, federally qualified healthcare center. And some churches are using models of lay health promoters, where lay people are trained by health professionals to share health information. So there's a lot of different models that can be considered and that are happening in terms of how churches are looking at promoting health. Now, from my perspective, as I look at my work in health ministries, I see three different components of what is happening in the church and what I see supported in Scripture in terms of the church's call to be a place of health, healing, and wholeness. And those three areas are, first of all, the looking inward, honoring the body. And that area is addressing the question of how does the church promote individual health and wellness for self and for others? Because it's not just about my health, but it's also about, other people having the opportunity to be healthy. The second dimension that is significant is what I call reaching out, health ministries of compassion and mercy. And that area is looking at how the church supports folks experiencing illness. Because sometimes, no matter what we may do the absolutely best things in terms of staying healthy, but chances are we're all going to experience illness at some point. Some people live with illness chronically. So how does the church walk faithfully with those people? And the third dimension is standing together, the ministries of health justice. And that has to do with looking at the root causes of some of the health inequities. And there are significant ones in the United States that are of concern to the church. So that area is looking at the question of how does the church work towards health for all? Now, you need all three to have a full perspective on health and to have a full perspective on Scripture's challenge in terms of health. You need all three. So let me highlight in each of those areas some of the things that churches are doing that may be of interest to you. Well, when it comes to the looking inward, honoring the body, churches are involved in faith-based health education and wellness groups. And there are a lot of different resources, that are available to help churches do this. One of the ones that I particularly like is called Living Compass, that was created by Scott Stoner, an Episcopalian priest therapist, identifying 8 different dimensions of wellness. I'd like to add 2 others to his model, but his materials are great. And they have information for, that can walk you through doing wellness groups, dealing with motivational interviewing. What area of wellness do you want to work on? And they also have resources for teenagers, which is a nice dimension. Now, I want to say with each of these resources, though, you always have to look at what fits for your congregation and community. So there may be some areas that you might need to adjust, but these are starting points. Now, faith and food. I notice it sounds like all 3 of our speakers we're all gardeners. I don't think that was in my. I don't think that, but if you see if I go to my screensaver, you'll see my garden. Faith and food, that's one of my passions. But there's a lot that the church is doing and can do in that area. Because if you think about what promotes health, how we eat is like one of the most fundamental things, and how that connects us to creation every day. So there's some great resources in that area that churches are using. The North Carolina Council of Churches has a great curriculum on eating well for ourselves, for our neighbors, and our planet. Notice those 3 different dimensions that they're including in that wellness area. The Presbyterian Hunger Network has a resource originally created in Chicago called Just Eating, Practicing Our Faith at the Table. That is a curriculum to help churches walk through looking at issues of faith and food. And one of the great things about that model is that it's been adjusted, it's been adapted so that it's available in Spanish as well as English. Mm-hmm. It has an adaptation specific to the culture of African American churches, and it also has a middle school curriculum. So all of those contextual things are important when you're looking at churches promoting health. The other thing that churches are doing is even being mindful about what kind of food do you serve. Does anybody go to a church where you don't eat? Well, in COVID days, that before COVID, did anybody go to a church where you didn't eat? I don't, So the other dimension of wellness, there's a lot going on, is faith and fitness, and looking at how do you combine faith with trying to engage your body in good health practices. And there's some great resources and things that churches are doing in that area. There's the concept of a walk to Jerusalem or a walk to Bethlehem, where a church collectively, I've done this with my own church and at the seminary, where you collectively try to walk virtually, physically walk and then add it up, the distance between Chicago and Jerusalem, and do that over Lent as a Lenten discipline. And it becomes a community activity, because how do we help encourage other people to be healthy? And you can do all kinds of fun things with it, talking about the destinations you might stop on the way, and do things in that area. You can also combine praying and walking, small groups and walking, because now, living during a pandemic where it's better to get together outside, how can you combine physical activity with that? Some churches are using the tradition of music, doing things like gospel aerobics, where you're doing aerobics, but the music that you're doing also has a faith meaning and a connotation, so that you're kind of making that faith and fitness connection. And some churches, usually these are only very large churches, actually have gyms. And there's a Covenant Church in Redwood City, California, Peninsula Covenant, that has a community center with a gym. And realizing that as fitness is part of our culture, is there a way for the church to connect with that? And the final area that I want to highlight on this honoring the body has to do with looking at the church and preventive care. One thing, before COVID, churches often were involved in doing flu immunizations. During COVID, in the Chicago area, lots of churches, particularly in the African American and Latino neighborhoods of Chicago, have been involved in being sites for COVID vaccinations. I just finished participating in the Health Ministries Association conference, where I heard about a large group in Kentucky where the faith community nurses were instrumental in getting COVID vaccinations out to people. And sometimes churches have also been sites for screening, for cancer screening. There's a program called the Witness Project for breast cancer awareness, where people who've survived breast cancer give their testimony in church and encourage other people to have examine their breasts and have mammograms. So there's a lot of different ways that churches are involved in prevention. And then finally, living during a pandemic, churches are involved in wellness in terms of what do they do to prevent infection, very practically speaking. And so if churches were not thinking about health before the pandemic, we've had to think about it. We've had to think about it since. And those who had health ministries in place were in a better shape, place to get started. Second dimension, reaching out, the health ministries of compassion and mercy. That's the area the church has always been strongest in terms of responding when there's a need. How do we listen and walk with people through the experience of illness and disability? Care teams are one way that's some churches have developed that in response to COVID. Other churches had that in place beforehand. Looking at mental health ministry, and there's a national program for mental health first aid training that churches can use to talk about what do you do when somebody's experiencing a mental health crisis. Support groups. I know churches who are doing chronic illness support groups, grief support groups, celebrate recovery, looking at addiction support groups. And more recently, again, living during a pandemic, healthcare workers. There's a church in Worcester, Massachusetts, who's involved in providing support to nurses who are on strike, looking at trying to have reasonable conditions for being able to provide care. Healing services, depending on your tradition, you calling on the practice of having services for healing, is a great way of engaging in compassion and mercy. Recognizing the impact of trauma on your congregation and your community. In Chicago, we have a congregationally trauma-informed network looking at, how can you recognize that and work with it. And the final area I want to highlight in this is also the whole question about access to health services, because sometimes people don't know what's available to them. And that's where health ministries, whatever model you're using, can help with that. And there are online services available. There's one that I highlighted in my PowerPoint, which you have available on Whova if you want to check that tells you about that. Now, the final area that I want to highlight is in the standing together, the Ministries of Health Justice. And this is important in trying to get down to, what are some of the root issues? I mean, it's if somebody is sick, boy, you want that compassion and mercy. You want them to be with them. But then you also want to go back and look at why are they sick? And are they and is that sickness from some reason that could be addressed? So looking at advocacy for individuals, families and communities. Looking at advocacy again in the pandemic context for health professionals. One of the areas when you look at issues of justice, you really have to look at partnership, because it depends on the size of your church, but you have to, if you're really going to get at root issues, it's not going to be just the church. It's going to be multiple churches. It might be multiple faith groups. It might be working in partnership with hospitals, with departments of health. And nowadays, hospitals and departments of health are very interested in working with the faith community, because they know that they have a way to access groups of people that are important for them to be able to do mutually beneficial things. And universities as well have been a resource for faith and health partnerships, because often they may get grants to start different kinds of programs. And there's a new one starting in North Carolina, looking at trying to increase fitness and increase eating fresh fruits and vegetables. And so a researcher gets that money, but it can benefit the church as well. Another important area, and I know Dr. Woodley is going to tell us more about that, is the whole area of creation care, because our connection to creation is so much impacts our health. And finally, learning about racism and its impact on health. There are two curriculums that I'm aware of that have been created for church settings to look at that whole question, recognizing that racism is a public health issue, and that if we want to look at some of the root causes of health issues and work towards health justice, that we need to do that. And so I leave you, as my time is winding up here, so much more we could say, that the health of each of us is related to the health of all of us. To me, that is the challenge I find very profoundly in Isaiah 58, and that we need to recognize that. So the churches have wonderful opportunities. There's many more examples, and you can take a look at the PowerPoint that I have provided. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to contact me. You have my email.
So my little presentation today, I've captioned Indigenous Peoples Healing in a Colonial Context. And I'll be speaking primarily about mission and Indigenous Peoples Health. That's where my expertise and experience is. Quoting Dom Helder Camara, Archbishop of Recife, Brazil, I want to start with this quote. "When I feed the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why the poor are hungry, they call me a communist." Thinking about that quote, in essence, the World Missionary Movement has spent a lot of time continuing a systemic dependency cycle of feeding indigenous and other disenfranchised peoples, but perhaps far too little time asking why the need exists in the first place and why it persists. I've spent most of my adult life asking questions like, why is it that indigenous people have the world's highest poverty rates, suicide rates, chronic disease rates, poorest housing, lowest education levels, etc.? Especially when indigenous peoples have the most to teach the world. But I do remember what Jesus said, the poor you will always have with you. Famous 60-minute reporter Dan Rather was interviewing Mother Teresa one time and asked her, Mother Teresa, why did Jesus say that? And Mother Teresa looked at him kind of quizzically and said, without the poor, the wealthy have no chance to be saved. In other words, the healing of the world's healthy wealthy and the world's impoverished ill are tied together. Indigenous poverty in the United States and Canada is widespread, all-encompassing, and it runs deep compared with the general population. We have a six-fold higher risk of alcohol use and disorder among American Indian and Alaska Natives than the general population, a six-fold higher rate of tuberculosis, 3.5 times the higher rate of diabetes, a threefold higher risk of depression, and a twofold higher risk of suicide. There are a lot more statistics I could quote, but I know people grow tired of depersonalized statistics. After all, they seem detached from real life stories. So in my 32 years as a representative of Jesus among our indigenous people, I want to personalize one of those stories. In 7 of those years, I pastored a Native American community where I held 66 funerals, and I won't go through all 66, but I want to tell you about the last one I did. We'll call him Thomas. He was in his mid-40s, the same age as me at the time. And he had struggled with alcoholism early in life and eventually found his way back home on the red road to sobriety. During his addiction, he developed type 2 diabetes, which was epidemic in Indian country. While his family was happy to have him back sober, they would face other challenges in the next several years with his health. No one wants to hear those sort of details of death by diabetes, so I'll spare you. But suffice it to say that type 2 diabetes eventually took his life, and as it and other chronic diseases do daily among our indigenous people in a settler colonial state. The practice of Thomas's particular tribe is to have an open casket at the cemetery as family members come by for one final look. And if you want, you can place something in the casket with your loved one. Thomas's son, age 6, was the same age as my son at the time. The sad little 6-year-old boy slowly walked up to his dad's casket, looked at him, and placed on his father's chest a baseball glove, and in the glove was a baseball. I'd recently been teaching my own son to catch a baseball. That reality just became too much for me. And at that point, I realized I had a wounding in my soul that would take decades to heal. I'd seen far too many indigenous people die. And it created a deep trauma in me and sent me into PTSD for years. And that was the last funeral I've ever officiated to this day. I continue to understand more fully that trauma in Indian country was inflicted first by empire, leading to post-colonial stress syndrome, and by the subsidiary effects of colonization, or PTSD. And that was often the intended results by the United States government and the church. That is, they wanted to cripple and demoralize indigenous peoples by forcing them to assimilate into a foreign culture and become dependent on them for their every need, whether through the Christian doctrine of discovery, residential boarding schools, the duplicity of the Christian Indian agents who work for the native betterment, or just those little Native American churches spread throughout the land that I call a poor imitation of a bad model. They all continue to reinforce the same spirit and values of American society. They all lead indigenous peoples to a road of devastation, often through self-destruction. And there's a strange irony present when comparing poverty, health, and wealth among the dominant white European-based cultures of Canada and the US to the present state of indigenous peoples in North America. Both societies base their wealth on what comes from the land. but there are different values concerning the distribution of those resources. Wealth among First Nations has always come from the abundance of what could be hunted, grown, harvested, or gathered from the abundance of the land. The glaring irony is the newcomers stole the land and subjugated the host people, making attempts to assimilate them into a capitalistic system while having very meager land and few resources from the land left at their disposal. In other words, they demoralized us, stole our capital, and then said, now become good capitalists. Then they belittled and ridiculed the Indians when they did not fit well into their system. But there was one flaw, and this is very important. Indigenous values were too much like Jesus and those of the early church. From an Aboriginal perspective, wealth was considered to be a shared community investment as opposed to private enterprise. Therefore, poverty was not thought of in the same way by Native Americans that people living in a society driven by capitalism and individualism think of it today. This point is important to remember because poverty, as modern First Nations know, is a relatively new concept in our development and adjustment to poverty status in American society, and it's become a debilitating factor. There is a through line from colonialism, land theft, mission work, Indigenous poverty, and poor health. Foremost among Indigenous values is the understanding of the inherent goodness of the land, along with the traditions and lifeways that have been lived upon the land. In other words, life in the old days and in the old ways had prescribed sets of remedies structured in society for maladies such as temporary poverty, and those all came from the land. Those structures and mechanisms of healing had been time-tested for multiple generations. Finding ways to make Indigenous Americans less poor, according to modern standards, may be helpful in some regards, but increased material wealth may not be the ultimate answer to Indigenous health predicaments. The European colonizing and missionizing disruption to Indigenous constructs of well-being inserted its values, ideas, and hopes in the midst of Native America, creating a dependency that has been a cruel taskmaster. Although relief from its intended marginalization may provide some temporary comfort, the Indigenous peoples of the US and Canada are not necessarily seeking the American dream today. My doctoral research that led to a PhD in intercultural studies was particularly about Native American values and mission. In my doctoral research, I set off to explore the possibility that the core values of most Native Americans might be centered in Indigenous concepts of well-being. For this exploration to occur, I needed to identify the core Indigenous values of various tribes found within their own well-being concepts, and then attempt to determine whether or not the core Indigenous values could be synthesized easily into one broad construct. Given that Western models of mission among Native Americans have failed abysmally, and that these colonial practices have devastated Native communities, my research saw a better way of pursuing mission among Native Americans by asking several important preliminary questions. Like, do Native Americans have a generally shared set of values that could guide the construction of new models of mission in North America Native communities? And if so, to what degree are these values shared among Native communities? I also ask what resources, particularly values, are available within Native American communities themselves for developing appropriate models of mission. And then I ask, could such resources be developed into authentic, integral mission models? That was a big project. I began the project with a three-pronged framework of biblical theological construction of shalom, which is the broad construct that seemed like it most fit Native America, and contextually based, anthropologically informed missiology and an Indigenous construction of decolonization and indigenization. A framework for studying values emerged based on the literature in the fields of counseling, sociology, anthropology, education, missiology, history, and religion. The values themselves emerged from conversations with elders and spiritual leaders who participated in extensive interviews and a survey of hundreds of Native Americans from all regions of the United States and most of Canada. I was able to establish among Native Americans a widespread construct I generally refer to as the harmony way. I was then able to isolate and examine 10 commonly held core values that exist within the framework of the Native American Harmony Way. In the Harmony Way values, we understand ourselves to be in harmony with all creation, not over creation. That is a relationship, a partnership, and reciprocity, not domination and thoughtless extraction. The research, along with my years of experience as a missionary among Indigenous people, as an anti-missionary and as a missionary from Indigenous people to the dominant white society, raised fundamental questions about past and current approaches to Native American mission and about the dangers of formulating mission models that are not based on Native American values and not within the framework of Native American concepts of well-being. Indigenous people's theology and healing begins with the earth and understanding ourselves as a relative to everything around us. Most Western theologies are absent of a theology of place. And if they do have a theology of place, that story would begin, and so far as we can see from here, with stolen land, ethnocide, and genocide being excused for reasons justifying white supremacy. Hopefully, my research, along with my wife's and my many years in mission, and our current co-leadership at Eloheh Indigenous Center for Earth Justice, is contributing to the practice of disrupting systems of missionary oppression and encouraging the formation of alliances to promote models of theology and service that are empowering and liberating for the earth and people, that is the whole community of creation. Eloheh attracts people of all ages and walks of life to learn to live in harmony with the land using traditional Indigenous knowledge as a guiding model. And I want to end with a very quick story. We have a story among my people called, it's the story of when the animals were all larger than they are, and they were up on a mountaintop, and they had no more room left, and there was just water surrounding them. And so they went to the Creator, and they said, Creator, can you make us more land? And so Creator said, yes, if you will dive to the bottom of the water and pull up some mud, I will take that mud and spread it out and create land for everyone. So they talked among themselves, and they said, well, who are we going to get to go get the land? And so the mud from the bottom. And so right away, Grandmother Turtle stepped up and said, I'll go get the mud. And they began to kind of whisper among themselves and say, Grandmother Turtle, you're a little bit too slow. We have faster animal people here. And so they said, how about Duck? And so they sent Duck out, and Duck tried to dive down, and she popped back up and dived down again, and she popped back up, and she came back embarrassed. And she said, I'm a whole lot better floater than I am at diving. And so then they said, well, then who else can we get? And Grandmother Turtle stepped up again. And she said, I'll go get the mud. And this time they just simply ignored her. And then they said, how about Otter? He's a really good diver and swimmer. He could go down and get it. So they sent Otter down, and then they came back 3 days later. They looked down the beach, and there's Otter eating a fish. And they said, Otter, what happened? And he said, I went to go get that mud, I guess it was. And I saw this fish, and I started chasing it. And what was I after anyway? Oh, Otter. So finally they said, somebody has got to do it. And so one more time, Grandmother Turtle stepped forward and said, I will go get the mud. And by that time, Beaver had already made a big speech. And she said, I don't even like to play. I just work, and I don't eat fish. So let me go try. So Beaver goes, and all these days go by. 6 days go by. And she comes back on the 6th day, and she says, it's so far down, I almost died. There's no way that we can do this. And so as they began to kind of cry among themselves, and they were all sad, Grandmother Turtle just slowly walked through and slid down into the water. First day goes by, and they're watching for the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth. On the 7th day, they spotted something floating in the water, floating up. It was Grandmother Turtle. Her feet were out, her tail was out, her head was out, and she was dead. And so the Duck and Otter and Beaver swam out, and they brought her back. And And everybody's really sad about Grandmother Turtle. And they were also sad for themselves because they had no more land to live on. And all of a sudden, someone looked down and they looked, and there was something in Grandmother Turtle's claw. And they spread it open, and there was a ball of mud there. And so they took that mud to Creator, and Creator spread it all out and created, in her honor, Turtle Island in the shape of a turtle. So when I ask, especially Indian children, what's the meaning to this story? What do you get from the story? Well, the first thing they say is they should have listened to the elder. They should have listened to Grandmother Turtle to begin with. She knew best. Folks, Indigenous people are the elders on this and other continents. Don't wait until we're all dead to discover, too late, the truth and power we had to heal the world, and perhaps even the world missionary movement. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Woodley, for that. Wow. Just take a moment. That's so powerful to think about the ways in which we are shaped by our elders and the importance of listening and respecting. With that, today I'll be talking about Black women flourishing, a unique model that we are developing or have developed in the process of fine-tuning here at Fuller Theological Seminary in the Graduate School of Psychology. So today I will be talking a little bit about the model, but before I get started, let me give you a brief overview of where we're going to go in this next 15 to 20 minutes or so. Next slide, please. Also, you all will find the slides on the app, so feel free to make yourself available to those there. So we're going to start with acknowledgements and introductions. And it's important to think about acknowledgements is not a perfunctory obligation, but really is something that helps to frame the work that has been done, as well as honoring the journey that we are on based on particular people who have supported it. And then we'll slide to some of the theoretical underpinnings, the constructs that have helped to inform the work that we do, followed by an overview of some of the key conversational partners or some of the models that are currently in practice that have shaped the ways that we have constructed the Black Women's Spirituality Research Lab and consultation groups, followed by the vision and the values that have emerged that constitute the work that we do. And then I'll end with some closing thoughts on some of the research that we're currently engaged in. So, to the women on the journey, there have been some key women, next slide please, who have helped to support the work that we're doing. And again, I acknowledge these women not simply for a perfunctory assignment, but as honoring their contributions and their generativity to the birth of this project. The first woman here, that of Doris Edwards Brooks, my mother, the woman who has shaped me and helped to mold me to value the contributions of all people, but specifically looking at the inherent ways in which Black women have come together for generations to support one another and thereby supporting communities. The second group of women that I would like to acknowledge today would be that of the St. Paul AME Pixley women. I call them my mothers. I grew up in an AME church in a small rural community. And I saw how these women banded together over births, over deaths, over marriages, over divorces, over pain, over suffering, over triumph. But there are ways in which they came together that imprinted on me the importance of sisterhood, the importance of caring communities. I would also acknowledge my mentor, colleague, and friend in Alexia Salvatierra. Some of you got to hear her earlier in the series speak. And I'll talk a little bit about her more specifically about the research that I was able to engage with her and her research in health and spirituality. Finally, two more partners that I want to talk about is that Jenny Pack, who's also a faculty member at Fuller, as well as my grad student, Shanita Scott, who helped to affirm and give voice to the work that was so important that we're doing today. And finally, to my UCLA, Harvard, Howard, Fuller, and CSPP sisters, this work is because of the work that we all did together. So, thinking about the introduction, next slide, please. One of the ways in which I will engage this talk is similar to what we just heard Dr. Woodley talking about in terms of the importance of looking to our ancestors, the importance of looking at the blueprints that they have left in terms of how we thrive, survive, and even flourish. George Floyd's murder brought the world's attention to the lived realities of Black people and our experiences with racism. At the same time, the racialized and economic inequities associated with COVID-19 robbed a disproportionate amount of Black and brown folks from both life and liberty. How do people cope with such inhumane brutality? How does one continue to go forward in the face of such devastation? Our answer has been to draw upon the blueprints left by our ancestors, to lean upon hope and action. Our foreparents have passed down a legacy of hope, the belief that the current situation will not always be as it is at this moment, and that there will be a time that will be existing where the present circumstances will be better. This inherited hope is not solely future-oriented or one that exists in the sweet by and by, but it's a hope that's multi-layered and textured, and it's tethered to the here and now and the not yet. Ernst, in her 2016 scholarship, describes this type of hope as one that unites action and change in the present and in the future. This hope requires that an individual or community acknowledge the terror of the present and demand that another reality is possible today and even tomorrow. Ernst explains this is complex hope. Complex hope allows us to call out and name the brutality that is experienced by systemic racism and structural forms of oppression, as well as the everyday racism, with the expectation that we will experience relief now and in the days to come. I would submit to you that Sojourner Truth knew about that complex hope. In her famous speech in 1851, she typifies complex hope as she challenged the victimization of Black bodies, specifically calling out the ills of white supremacy and patriarchy. Black women like Sojourner Truth responded to racism and sexism by intentionally recognizing the terrors that Black women endured, yet intentionally choosing to defy external expectations by developing their self-defined practices and organizing how they showed up in the world. Our foremothers offered a guide for survival, one which included learning and leaning into the complexities of their multiple social identities, navigating their spaces within the context of community, and most importantly, creating and holding on to hope, the belief that circumstances and situations have the possibility to change. This complex hope, I would incur, fueled Sojourner Truth's message and is a source of the strength that we draw from in the Black Women's Spirituality Lab, which focuses on Black women flourishing. The role of Black women's spirituality as a consultation group as well as a research lab is to draw upon the wisdom of our foremothers in intentional ways to cultivate an environment that supports Black women in defining themselves and moving towards wholeness and health on our own terms. Next slide. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how did we come up with the model? How are we constructing this model? There's about 6 different theoretical frameworks and constructs that we utilize to develop this. The first that I'll talk about is that of Black women in higher education. Like other marginalized communities, African American women have a long history of being subjugated and assessed with limitations due to their race, their gender, and class. Black women continue to encounter situations that impede our very existence, largely due to discrimination associated with these ills of racism, sexism, and classism. These inequalities are often amplified for Black professional women working in predominantly white spaces, where their experiences of being the only one or the only one of very few results in experiences of marginalization, isolation, and even distress. Consequences for Black women in general have been linked to significant health disparities, some of these same disparities that we heard Mary speak about earlier, even increased mortality rates. It's very real that oppression is literally making Black women sick and killing them. Now, while it's true that there is great oppression and that it takes toll on women spiritually, physically, mentally, emotionally, relationally, and on and on and on, it's also very true that Black women continue to persevere and develop strategies in order to persist. The Black Women's Spirituality Lab and Consultation Group seeks to be a part of uncovering, disseminating, and developing spaces where these strategies can be shared. It is our belief that in exploring the day-to-day lived experiences of Black women, we will see coping strategies that have allowed them to survive and, dare I say, even flourish. Black women are resilient, yet our resilience cannot be taken for granted and displayed as some superhuman strength or power. Sojourner Truth's question, "Ain't I a woman?" was intended to highlight the humanity of Black women and to shatter the myth of some superhuman or otherly strength that so too often leads others to overlook our pain or our own internalized messages that we must continue to carry a load or sustain a load that is unbearable. As Shanita Scott, my doctoral student, indicates in her research, her dissertation research, this idea of the superwoman archetype is consequential. As we think about the educational advancement in prior years, we've seen that Black women have used the academy as a means of social mobility, as well as enhancing the quality of life. While this attainment of educational degrees may propel Black women into greater social, financial, and even relational influence, there is a high cost that is paid. For some, the experiences of discrimination within these institutions weigh heavily and take a toll on one's overall well-being. Thomas and Holstead in 2001 highlight challenges that negatively impact Black women flourishing in predominantly white institutions. Barriers include exclusion from earning tenure and promotion, experiences of isolation and marginalization, and discrimination regarding lack of acceptance of their professional work. McCrae in 2011 states it well, and that faculty of color have to choose relevance or respect when developing their research agendas. Well aware that they will be judged by colleagues with different epistemological and ontological perspectives, meaning that to study anything other or to study things that are culturally relevant may be viewed as suspect. The role of connecting and cultivating solidarity and support has been but one solution that has been frequently acknowledged in the literature as a strategy for success. And it is that strategy that we take into Black Women Spirituality Research Lab, as well as consultation group. Now, when we think about the literature that focuses on mentoring women of color, specifically mentoring graduate women of color, we recognize that mentorship is commonly cited as fulfilling a host of functions, but is so important as a prominent factor in the successful matriculation of graduate students in terms of them thriving as early career professionals. So diving into that literature really impressed upon us the importance of creating these microcosms where specifically Black women can be mentored. Now, when we think of mentorship, sometimes we think of it traditionally as a unidirectional relationship. However, in thinking about mentoring Black women, it's really important to think about it as a multi-level and multi-directional impact, where there is communal mentoring, there is mentoring that happens within a rich ecosystem. And finally, we look at womanist theology and womanist psychology. And together, the importance of these are highlighting faith, religion, and the importance of offering a holistic approach, whether we're viewing biblical text or we're looking at the psychological impact on the Black community. Now, Solorano and Perez offer a really important factor that we've also adopted into our framework, that of our racial microaffirmations, which is a term that talks about the importance of subtle nonverbal strategies that help to reclaim the humanity and challenge the dehumanization of everyday racism, followed by the importance of our final concept that we looked at was community healing and storytelling. Now, community healing and storytelling is so important in terms of addressing racial trauma. You can look at this reference here if you want to learn more about the Seahart model, which I strongly suggest that you do, because in that model, it really unpacks the ways in which this rich oral tradition is effective in healing. Next slide, please. In this slide, I just want to highlight a few models that currently exist and how they have impacted the model that I'm speaking of today. The first model was that in terms of the spirituality in women of African descent research teams founded by Dr. Alexia Salvatierra. This research team, as well as her prostate cancer and African-American men research team, really highlighted not only the population that we're serving, but how to culturally adapt treatment models to support communities of color. Next, we have Sisters on the Wall, which is an informal grassroots group that had a strategic purpose of supporting the everyday life of Black women. Now, what was key in this group is they took an approach that emphasized faith in action and justice. How do you engage social justice in the everyday? Followed by a model presented in the Sisters of the Academy, which is an institute developed to facilitate the success of Black women. So this particular model looked at research and how to develop researchers within the academy and provide support. And lastly, the Next Generation program is a program developed by Dr. Henderson Daniels. Now, this program was solely for researchers, but it offered an opportunity to see how systemic changes can impact the longevity of Black women within higher education. Next slide, please. I won't go through this in depth, but suffice to say the concepts that we talked about, as well as the models, have led to the vision and the values within the Black Women's Spirituality Lab, which embodies citizen scholarship, meaning that we really are a part of the community before we're a scholar, that embodies spirituality, that looks at research as an opportunity for resistance, that believes in the concept of emerging strategy, that there are key conversations that happen within the room when the Black women get together that can transform, followed by the importance of engaging in community care, centering the Black experience, and making research accessible. And in this final slide, I want to talk to you about, next slide, please, what it looks like when you have an environment for Black women to thrive. In 2017, Fuller Theological Seminary and the Graduate School of Psychology graduated 7 Black doctoral women. That is absolutely phenomenal, and hence we call them the Phenomenal 7. The research project that we're looking at now is understanding their experiences and being able to articulate both the barriers as well as the strengths that were utilized and strategies in order for them to successfully matriculate through the program, in order to develop even more detailed processes and implications for how institutions can create spaces for the thriving and the flourishing of Black women. Thank you.
That was a wonderful presentation. All 3 of those presentations were so powerful. Let's go to these questions, because the questions are also pretty all over the map. So the first question is, do you have any suggestions to engage theological schools, church leaders, to engage their students and parishioners in better body stewardship and a robust theology of health? What are the touch points to sensitize instead of abrogate to the professionals? So that's a lot in that. I want to open it up to any of the 3 of you on that one.
I can begin on that point. I think one of the things is to have the conversations, to recognize that health is part of the conversation in seminary, in your preparation for ministry. At North Park Theological Seminary, where I recently retired, we had a number of classes on themes related to faith and health, and having those is a way of getting people to think about it. Another way is studying Scripture and looking at how Scripture talks about health, because there's a lot. If you look at what's happening in the healing stories of Jesus, if you look at how the Hebrew Scriptures and their orientation towards community health, that you could do a lot there. And I think also then looking at one's own knowledge, what you know from your own tradition in terms of what promotes health. Because we all know something about health, whether or not we ever do a degree in any health-related professional, we all know something about it. So that would be my thought. I don't know if anybody else would want to add.
Dr. Armstrong, Dr. Woodley, anything you want to add to this?
Sure, I'll chime in real quick. The thing I would say is looking at ways in which, and I'm speaking more for psychological health, which obviously impacts other areas of our health, but thinking about the ways in which contemplative practices can increase one's psychological, mental health, thinking about ways in which centering moments, that's a practice that we have intentionally done at every one of our research labs, which is probably different from most research labs that you go into. The very first thing that we do is engage in contemplative practices, be it breathing, be it reflection. There's some communal practice that we engage in as a means of showing and modeling for students and those who are participating in the group that this is something that you can do wherever you are. This is not just something that you do here, but it's really practicing the practice, I think, is important.
Dr. Woodley.
Yeah, there's a lot of really good health programs out there. I think, one of the best I've seen is Seventh-day Adventists have this program called Take 10. It's 10 days and it's a holistic program. But I think for seminaries in particular and higher education, the problem is that when you begin with a Platonic dualistic worldview, and that it permeates everything in our society, and it creates hierarchies, and it creates extrinsic categorization, and then it creates, these binaries and things like this, that people don't understand what they why they categorize their brain from their body, or their health from their learning, and I call this dilemma putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. And I think the only way to do that is to challenge the Western worldview to come up with a more indigenous worldview that understands us as a whole person. And it's not bad to create all these categories. It's not necessarily a bad thing. The bad thing is that when we try to live out of the categories as if they're the whole reality.
So I'm going to actually follow up on that by jumping to question 3. Question 2 is about music. And so we'll do that maybe at the end, because I think there's some others that we need to get to first. But just to get you ready. So at some point we'll talk about music. But question number 3 says, can you address the issues which are especially clearly present in the U.S. culture of individualism, privacy, self-sufficiency, etc., as challenges to a community care model? Are there times when confidentiality can become an idol in some cultures? So really interesting question, right? And I think a question that all of you can respond to. Who wants to start us off? Do you want to keep going with where you were, Dr. Woodley? Because it feels like this builds and then we'll go back around.
Yeah. So, all that individualism and the competition and, all of those kinds of things come out of that Western worldview. So I've got a book coming out in April called Indigenous Theology in the Western Worldview, a Decolonized Approach to Christian Doctrine. And basically what I'm doing is I'm exposing the history and the understanding in all these categories and why we have them. And until we understand why we do what we do, it doesn't matter if we find a good program, we're going to just fall right back into doing what we did before usually, because it's our thinking that needs changing. It's our worldview, and worldviews aren't immutable. They can be changed. And part of the way that we do that is by understanding that in our, epigenetics, we're all indigenous from somewhere. And we have that in us, and it may be a long ways back for a lot of people, but we still have a claim to that indigeneity, and we need to get in touch with our own indigeneity in order to develop a more indigenous worldview.
Thank you. Let's go to Dr. Armstrong next, and then Dr. Chase-Ziolek.
Sure. When I think of confidentiality, immediately my mind goes to clinical practice and how we train our students in terms of confidentiality. I think in the flourishing model that we're developing, it is a communal approach. And I think that the individual approach does cause some very significant limits and inhibits, much in the way as Dr. Woodley said, the growth, even the imagination in terms of what could be, the possibilities, because it's so insular focused. So I would just say I affirm that the ways in which we're currently doing things are not working. There needs to be a way in which we think about community.
Dr. Chase-Ziolek.
I think I want to focus on that first part of that, the question about individualism versus community. And I think that our current pandemic has highlighted that very starkly. That it's not just about what I do individually, but what I do with my body can impact the health of other people's bodies, as well. And even beyond the pandemic, even the choices that I make about how I eat, can have an impact on other people who are growing my food and producing my food. And so I think having that. So I think I would affirm what Dr. Woodley is saying in terms of, worldview, of having a sense of that. I go back to, the health of each of us is related to the health of all of us. And while what I do individually makes a difference in terms of my own state of well-being, it's not sufficient. And I make those choices in the context of communities, that a community in which I live and work that either that both enables and limits, the choices, that I have. So, so I think having I think that question is calling for a broader perspective, in how we talk about health, that we look beyond just, just the structure of our, of our own physical being, but we look at the context and all the contributing factors. And yeah, that's what I would say.
The image of the body of Christ comes back to me in this.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The next two questions are actually, I think, intertwined. Or not. Well, there's two questions that are about indigeneity. I think what we'll do is go to the racism question and then come back to the indigeneity question, and then finish with the music question. So the racism question: if racism is a health issue, what are the practical ways nations and churches can deal with it? Thank you. So let's start with you, Dr. Armstrong, on that one, and then get people's input.
Sure, great question. I think one of the ways that we are looking at dealing with it, and specifically the Black Women's Spirituality Group, is combating it with microaffirmations, creating spaces. So we are not, essentially, we are recognizing, I would say our proposition is we recognize that racism exists, and we're also saying, how can we be strategic in terms of those structures and systems that we find ourselves in? So I think that's the work that we're doing, and that's how we're looking at it.
Today is the first time I've heard the word microaffirmation. It's really powerful. We hear microaggression all the time. We don't hear microaffirmation. So
and I think that's part of the conversation too, is how do we shift the language? How do we start talking about the things that are existing and the ways in which we are moving towards, I would say, more supportive structures and systems?
Yeah, great. Comments on this? Dr. Chase-Ziolek.
I would say that there are, first of all, you have to understand it. I think that if you're going to address racism as a public health issue, you have to understand, what's going on. And I am aware of two curriculum created for faith-based contexts. One from the Church Health Center in Memphis, and looking at racism and health from a biblical perspective, and another from the United Church of Christ that's talking about racism as a public health issue that I know churches have used. So that there are those are two frameworks that I'm resources that I'm available for in trying to understand what is going on. So before you can do anything, you have to have some understanding of what is happening. So I think that could be a starting point. But there's so many different ways that racism can play out. And there's one thing that our seminary has been involved in that I think ultimately will have a tremendous impact on health, and that's been education in the prison setting. And in prison advocacy, looking at how racism plays out in sentencing, but making seminary education accessible, in the seminary setting. And so I think there's a lot of different places where you could be looking at points for impact. But first, I think you have to start with understanding the complexity, understanding, the history, understanding what it means to, where there's been racism and where there's been privilege. And I would do a shout out for a new book by a colleague of mine in our denomination on subversive witness, leveraging your power, leveraging your privilege. That's not quite the right title. Dominic Dubois Gilliard, great book about looking at where you have privilege. How can you use it for the good of everybody?
So, Dr. Woodley, if you want to comment on this one.
Yeah, jumping off that last point, I I don't think that we can win the war against racism in this country, because racism is a result of white supremacy. And so we talk a lot about the intersectionality of racism, but it all boils down to the reason we have racism is because of white supremacy. The country was founded, it's ubiquitous in all our systems, and for the white and really male, wealthier male, and now for those wealthier white male corporations and trillionaires and billionaires. And until we address the history of the foundation of our country, that it was not created for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, or women in particular, and that we look at white supremacy as not like, people in sheets, but the normalization of things that make white people comfortable, right? That the systems that create that, the normalization of that is white supremacy. And so that's where I think we have to begin. I think racism is a subsidiary of white supremacy.
So now we're going to move to two questions on Indigenous aspects. One of them was translated from Korean. So we'll get to as close to it as we can. It was one of our Korean listeners. So this is translated directly. The wounds of First Nations or Indigenous people in North America are that their lives are marginalities in the trauma of losing their language and culture to this land. In what areas can we actually help Indigenous peoples for a healthy world? And I want to share question 6 at the same time because they're connected. Dr. Woodley, have you done any research into the impact of Christianity on the traditional role of elders as wisdom keepers and agents of holistic healing in First Nations communities? What can the church learn from that history to help bring restoration? So I think those two are very connected questions.
Yeah, I'm trying to keep this to bite-sized. So first of all, the best thing that you can do to help is to empower Native organizations and Native people who are actually doing the work themselves. We don't need more dependency. We need empowerment to do the work ourselves. And that's the most difficult problem that Natives face, especially organizations that aren't tribal and depend on grants, is to get the support to be able to do the things that we know we should be doing. Now, that's if you want to go beyond that and say, how do I build relationship and get involved in something, some way to empower that's going to last and that we can build relationship, which is hopefully the ultimate goal. Then you have to find cultural guides to walk you through it. You have to be educated. You have to have lamentation and, public repentance of the sins that have been committed and speak truth to power. And then there has to be restitution and the reparations and relationship built. And then there has to be memorializing this. Before you can do all of that, I go back to, you have to get connected to your own indigeneity. And there's a lot of ways to do that. Everything that I do is basically to help people decolonize and indigenize. All my writings, everything my wife and I do here with our schools and our cohorts and everything else. And I usually go through the front door and attack it theologically. I've got books on, theological subjects and everything else. But a book's coming out in January called Becoming Rooted. And I'm going to show it because I was told by somebody else, don't get on without pimping your book. So that's it. It's 100 days of reconnecting with sacred earth. And what they are is short reflections and action points to break up the dualism, action points that each person can do for 100 days to get them in touch with the indigeneity and connection to the earth. And so I'm doing everything that I can to help people do that. My wife as well. And because we don't think until people begin, we don't think until people sort of grasp that they can actually go through the rest of helping everybody. It's like what we don't need is just saying, throwing money around and not being used in good ways. And that brings me to the last point, which is models. What we need more than anything, I used to believe that, the more people reach, the better. But now what I believe in is good models. And so help people who are doing the work to build good models. That's the bottom line.
Oh, wonderful. We have 3 minutes left, which is, I think, enough time to tackle that question that I put aside earlier. Is there empirical evidence that music affects healing? What types of conditions are best managed with music therapy? And I would want to broaden that a little bit just to talk about the role of music in the work that all of you do. I think it's a great thing to end on, because we're actually going into a song from our family in Ghana that is sending a worship song to end. So if you can all comment on this in some way.
Well, I don't know about I know about the impact of music experientially, more so than I'm not a music therapist, and I know how music, speaks to my soul and my well-being. And I think in the church setting, the way that music tells stories, that you start singing you begin the song, "Great is thy faithfulness." I can't recite all the verses, but if you start the music, I can sing them all. And so there's ways in which music, help to tell stories, stories of faith and God and creation and all of that I think can be very powerful. So I think in music and participating in music groups, practically speaking, is something that I've had people talk about. Being part of a choir can be very good for your health. It's not a health ministry intentionally, but being part of a group and using your gifts for others and the physicality of it can be very good for you.
Thank you. Dr. Woodley, so we're just going the same order that we did before it.
Real quick, we talk about being whole persons, right? In a whole reality, in a whole community, in a whole community of creation. And you go outside and what you hear most often is not silence, but you hear music coming from the birds and coming from the wind and it's singing praise to Creator, right? And so we have the opportunity to express something deep within our spirit, to let it out, and then sometimes let it out together, which is even more joy, right? And so it expresses gratefulness and thankfulness in a way that maybe art is another venue for that, but in ways that can't be expressed otherwise. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Dr. Armstrong. Finish us up.
Yes, and I would just say to what both my co-presenters have said, there's a huge body of research within the field of psychology that looks at music therapy, that documents the importance of that as an intervention to help with things from trauma to depression to anxiety. I think there is a way in which music calls us back to the Creator, as Dr. Woodley just said. I know in my own practice as being part of worship teams, how absolutely important that is to me as an individual. Just you can come in feeling any kind of way, but by the time you leave and singing with other people, how it transforms how you are experiencing your time and day. So I would say absolutely, it's definitely important.
Well, I want to thank the three of you just so much. I don't have words to thank you for what you all brought today and how powerful the combination was